Oh, geez. Anyways, it's great to be here. And, in some ways, the comments by the parliamentary secretary and Mark Shaw were really reassuring because many of the things that I wanted to flag are clearly being thought about and addressed in an intelligent way at the most senior levels. And the notion of kind of doubling down on issues of access, talent, and trust, it's kind of the punchline for what I'm going to say. Nevertheless, I will take my 10 minutes to raise a few issues that I'm hoping we will dig in on today. And, I'm old, maybe the oldest person in the room. Sad to say, but I've been working on technology adoption for over 30 years, including early stages of the internet and John Manley's innovation strategy and Don Tapscott's books and so on. And it's interesting because a lot of the lessons we've learned historically don't apply anymore. The pace of change is so different that you can't plan when you can't predict. The unknown unknowns are so overwhelming that, I have one friend who's deep into work on AI. He spends 4 hours a day trying to keep up on what's changing on top of his regular job. That being said, interestingly, many of the issues that did emerge in the early days of the internet, digital transformation, and so on, in my view, still apply. How many of you have heard of the productivity paradox? One, two. This was the notion coined like more than 30 years ago that our investments in technology were not producing the results that we expected. And I think that we currently have an AI paradox for similar reasons. The issue is not that the investments don't pay off. They don't pay off overall because some organizations, some people, some sectors are getting tremendous benefits and others are not. And that disparity between the technology haves, the technology have-nots, the technology users, the technology use-nots, in my view, is one of the challenges that we really have to acknowledge and grapple with. I talk a lot about the AI paradox and the fact that Geoffrey Hinton won a Nobel Prize and we lag behind OECD countries in terms of adoption. And some of you have heard me say this before. Part of it is the challenge in terms of understanding that if you build it, they will not necessarily come. Because Canada is a country of small, medium enterprises. And I spend most of my time with SMEs, and they are focused on trying to pay the bills, right, and keep the lights on. They do not have the same capacity as large organizations to invest and implement. The power, though, of SMEs is that unlike, are there any bankers in the room? A lot of the large corporations, despite what they say, are implementing AI to reduce headcount. There is no question about that. And we're already seeing tremendous disruption in entry-level jobs and so on. Most of the SMEs we work with, however, are small. They're tiny. They are not focused on reducing headcount. They're focused on building capacity, growing their markets, innovating, doing more with less. And so I think that is an amazing potential that we need to really double down on. The other thing I wanted to say is the gap between the potential of the technology, and I'm doing some weird projects on public mobile robots, and have any of you seen the physical AI enabled robot that can load a dishwasher? How many have seen that video? Google it. My next husband. Right? The potential and the stuff that comes out almost on a daily basis is really mind-boggling. And yet, we cannot get rid of fax machines in our healthcare system. Think about that. I can make an appointment with a manicurist easier than I can get an appointment with a physician, right? Calling. I went to a real doctor's appointment yesterday. there was a sign that said it was a 1 to 4 hour wait. Be patient. Not an emergency department, a doctor's office where I had an appointment. So we have kind of the ridiculous on the one hand, in terms of the lack of technology adoption, and the sublime in terms of the tremendous opportunities. And that's something we really have to grapple with. Part of the problem we see, I think, in the data, and we do a lot of research on this, is the way in which we're defining AI varies quite considerably. So some of you probably saw the reports that quote the Stats Canada data saying only 12% of Canadian companies are using AI. How many of you have seen that? Okay. What the report actually looked at, the question they asked is, are you using AI in your operations to develop products and services? That is a really specific application of artificial intelligence, as opposed to, I think it was BDC asked the question of small businesses, are you using AI? 39% said yes. And then when they actually gave them a list of applications, it bumped up to 60%. So how we're defining this also really matters. We have to recognize there really is a clear and present danger. How many of you have been tracking the Mythos stuff, Anthropic, and the banks? And AI apocalypse is my new word. I do think some of the Terminator visions are real and something we have to take into consideration. We can't sort of wallpaper over what those risks are, because we know from the history of technology that the, quote, good guys mostly observe the rule of law, although that's becoming more questionable these days, mostly play by the rules, and the bad guys don't. So the threats in terms of how some of these tools can be weaponized is something that we really have to grapple with. The opportunities for increased productivity, massive. The potential impact in terms of dislocation, traumatic. You know, some people are saying, 30% of jobs might be at risk and 30% might change and 30% will be the same. I think it's 100% are going to change. And the only thing that I differ with he was an economist, is that I think in addition to the 30% that may disappear, there are lots that may be created. And I think that's what we really have to focus on as a country. The final thing I really wanted to underscore that I think we need to recognize is for the last, since the turn of the century, we've had a STEM obsession, right? STEM, coding, teach coding earlier, play coding algorithms to the baby before it's born so it hatches being able to code. You know, don't take those general university courses in basket weaving, because lots of us do that. Focus on STEM, right? The co-founder of Anthropic, what did she say? Now is the time we need arts and social sciences. How is that? The focus on STEM, which we do need, we absolutely need those deep technology skills. That's why we got a Nobel Prize. But the focus on STEM doesn't help us with the adoption issues, right? Because engineers, computer scientists typically like to build stuff because they can, often without thinking about markets, often without thinking about consumer behavior, organizational change, all of the adoption issues, the regulatory, the ethical, the policy issues. And so if we focus only on STEM, we are actually missing what I would define as the AI adoption skills that we desperately need in order to drive things forward. And then the final layer of the pyramid is, of course, AI literacy for all, because all of us are being affected by AI, whether we use it in our jobs or we don't. And the deep fakes and the schemes and the frauds that are now being perpetrated are a real risk to individuals. I won't repeat what Mark and Creed talked about in terms of leaving no one behind, but I'll just end by saying that, when we think about equity, diversity, and inclusion with a big focus on inclusion, it really is marketing 101. It's not about wokeness. It's about the fact that women are 50% of the workforce and they make 70% of the purchasing decisions. 27% of the workforce identifies as having a disability. 25% of the workforce are racialized. And Indigenous peoples and those who identify as 2S LGBTQ+ are smaller percentages but have lots of allies. So if you don't take into account those groups, you are fishing in a very, very small pond. So I think equity, diversity, and inclusion has to cut across all of these issues, and I'm looking forward to the discussion with the panel. Thank you very much.
I'm just going to grab. Thank you so much, Wendy. And please note that that error has no reflection upon how much we love and respect you. Okay. I'm going to ask the rest of the panel to join you. Is this on? Thank you for coming out this morning. My name is Karen Sabwa with Sabwa Fair Consulting. I'm very happy to be here to moderate the panel today. And if I could just introduce them. So to my left, we have Vidya ShankarNarayan. I say it right? Good. Who's the Senior ADM for People, Culture, and Digital Solutions. And then we have Shannon Lundquist, who's the Vice Chair and Senior Client Partner, Deloitte. And we have Dr. Wendy Cukier, who you just heard from, our founder and academic director at Diversity Institute Academic Research. So I know that Wendy just gave us a really good grounding on what we're about to talk about, but I just want to add a little bit of another element to this. So this conversation is about what it actually takes to move AI curiosity to AI adoption in a way that's practical, responsible, and trusted. We heard those words here this morning, both our earlier speakers. Ideally, what we'd like to have you do is leave today with at least one AI action that you can take when you go back to your organization. So I'm hoping that you find some nugget that you can bring back. So without any further ado, I'm going to get on with the questions. So our first question is, what are the real barriers to AI adoption for SMEs and workers in Canada beyond the hype? Is there anyone that wants to take that first?
I've already done a lot of talking, but I'll just be brief. I think it's important, when we talk about SMEs in particular, we're talking about everything. And so I think, when we look at AI adoption, we look at sector, right, which is important because the issues in healthcare are very different than agriculture, infrastructure, manufacturing, and so on. We look at stage of development because the issues that we're facing with startups very different than companies with 100 employees that have been around for a long time or, are going through succession issues. And we also look at identity issues because Indigenous entrepreneurs, for example, in the North, don't talk about access to financing. They talk about access to internet. So we have to really think about the characteristics of those companies first off. And then we really have to dig in on the use cases. And that's something we've been spending a lot of time on is, the low risk, low hanging fruit of automating your expense accounts and automating your RFPs and managing your customer service, et cetera, et cetera. That's stuff that is easy to do with off-the-shelf tools. It's not complicated. And, the estimate is if you could save a half an hour a day it would translate into billions and billions of dollars of improved productivity. So when we think about how we can move forward without taking on a lot of risk, those are some of the things that I think need to be addressed. We really need to dig into this. Goes back to competitive advantage in IT 30 years ago. What is the company trying to do, and how can AI help them do it better? And we've got to get out of the, use it because it's cool and groovy, and really focus on organizational goals and objectives.
That was excellent. I'm just going to pick up on one of those comments, and I found it in working with SMEs as well. It has to start with the business need. You don't want the tool just for a toy. You need the business need first. Anyone else want to jump in? So, wow, Wendy, you were awesome. I'm going to jump in, and so of course, the bulk of my work is facing the government and how we can ensure that all of our government, I would say, public servants they have the skills. But I'm going to add a couple of points, and Wendy, you really highlighted with regards to, maybe 30 years ago when we were speaking about the technology, getting ready for technology era, is that we called it the digital divide. Now it's going to soon become the AI divide. And people having the skills and being able to be aware, when do I need to use tools versus when do I actually need to do something, I would say, more traditionally or manually. And in my role, I'm already seeing that just within the government. This we of course have. We are the largest employer. And then when you look at the SMEs, SMEs, small and business and medium-sized entrepreneurs in Canada form close to 98% of Canadian businesses. It's less than 2% are in the large-scale entrepreneurs. So when you're looking at 98% of businesses are small and medium, which is 5 to 10 people, you can just imagine the level of anxiety that could already started with regards to where do I get skilled AI resources, and then when do I need to use AI? So I know I'm putting out some questions there because for us to continuously think about it. So I'm going to pass it on to Shannon now.
Yeah, I think that, in this conversation where these things may not be like the other on the stage here, because I'm going to focus on really the human agency components and how we remove these barriers and help make adoption happen. Because it's very hard to manage innovation at pace. We have, I think actually, is that better? When we're operating in environments of fear and distress, so how do we create the foundations? Is that better? Is that okay? To be able to seize the opportunities, remove those barriers, and really normalize AI as a part of our organizations. Deloitte released its annual State of AI report in March, and there's some great stuff in there. There's particular notes on the Canadian environment as well. And just in terms of a few things that Wendy touched on, Mark-Sean had touched on them as well. But really around, access is the adoption lever, but we're not seeing that it necessarily results in increased value as we've talked about. So how do we ensure that we're creating an environment where we're intentional on use of AI, where we're setting up KPIs on what that looks like, where we talk about trust, where we track successes and failures, and are very open and transparent about that. A piece I know that Vidya thinks about a lot is rethinking jobs and careers around AI and ensuring that we have humans in the loop. We talk a lot about this in our organization. Readiness in our AI strategies does not necessarily equal readiness in our operational strategies as we're seeing. And so how do we help our leaders and our practitioners and our SMEs be operationally ready to take on some of these tools? And finally, and Mark spoke about this, we need to ready our physical and infrastructure foundations. I feel like I have like another mic on me. I thought we should just use one mic and share. I'm all set. Okay, we'll hang up the feedback. Great. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Shan. And if I could just pick up on one of your comments about operationalizing things. From a practical perspective, the reality out there for SMEs is a lot different than what a lot of us understand. And for AI, I've walked through the journey a couple of times with people that are struggling. And they're struggling because they're lean and mean and they're fighting to just keep the lights on. I know that Wendy mentioned that earlier. So, they may not have the expertise available in technology or cybersecurity or risk management. They're good at what they do within their subject area of expertise and at their job. But so it's just to know that really when rubber hits the road, it's a tough slog, and AI is not perfect yet. We're all in this journey. We're all in this road together, and not just in Canada, but internationally. And a lot of people are looking at this from a lot of different lenses. So to open up our ideas to understand it. So there's a lot going on, and we just want to try and help and move the markers forward. So what can we do? I think we're going to move on to the second question. What can we do? In positioning forward, this is a question I'm going to direct to Shannon first. How do we inspire the use of AI tools to help seize the opportunities that Canada is facing?
Hello now? You good? Perfect. Okay, there we go. One of the things that I talk quite a lot to our teams and to our clients across the country and in fact around the world, we're talking about this a lot, is yes, to continue to focus on the productivity, but to also focus on reimagining. And I think one of the keys to unlocking AI adoption is really the play factor. And I'm just going to take a moment to give you an example about how we're used to life on our team. And we have now done this with probably 600 people in our organization. And we're getting together in groups of 25. And we're not giving out all of the licenses for all of the tools to everyone. We have facilitators for the group of 25, and we take a real business issue and we work the tool. And people get into the tools and they play and they become less scary and they become more useful. And I personally, of course, now have my own favorite tools, and those are fellow, and we can just dump 10,000 things, and it makes this really nice one-page infographic for me. But it has really helped to ensure that people say, okay, I'm now going to reimagine how this can actually be used in my job versus replacing and my job. And it has created this opportunity for teams to see, particularly agents, but all sorts of AI and automation to be part of their team emotions, a companion to the.
Just a follow-on question to that. So, you have, and it's wonderful. What a great way to approach adoption. How do you share that? So once those 25 people learn something, how do you share that across your organization?
Yeah, so we're starting to roll out some of the basic, I call them the basic tools, and then we have, high flying users. People are going to use them every day. I mean, I use some of the tools every day. Will I use a lot of the creative tools every day? Probably not. But we're starting to use storytelling to roll those out as well. And a big piece of this, when we think about, Mark's talked about agency, focus, and leadership. Part of the leadership piece too is to create that psychological safety where we're talking about how we're using the tools. I'm a tech optimist. I'm not a Pollyanna. I understand that, certain roles, certain tasks, certain jobs, certain processes. If you think about Deloitte's business, the entire audit and tax business is going to undergo massive transformation. But there's also so many opportunities for the human capabilities to be introduced there, and that's what we're focused on.
Would anybody else like to? What a great example that you shared with us, Shannon. So I'm going to give you, I would say, from a public service perspective, a program that I'm actually currently running. So public service, we have 5 generations working together. I think that is now becoming the case across all sectors, 20s all the way to 60s. Many of my employees or employees across the government, they started before the internet. In fact, computers were coming into the workplace when they started. So fear and anxiety, which I already mentioned earlier with regards to, my God, this is like AI is basically just going to take my job away. That is one. Second is for the ones who are optimistic, they don't feel included because they think that they don't even speak the right language to even ask the questions as to how can I actually improve my skills. And then we have Canada. I mean, we are a country of immigrants. I'm an immigrant myself. Significant employment equity, which is, I would say, our diversity is our richness. So when you bring these, I would say, this interesting mix together, one of the programs that I've actually launched, it's now year 2, we called it the Future Innovators Program. We started it specifically for across the government, Black employees who identify as both in English and French. And this is giving them access to not just the tools, to Shannon's point with regards to where can I use the tools in my job? Because tools are plenty. I mean, every day I think a new tool is coming out, but how is it going to actually support me? And how do you actually go through that learning process? May not be one day. It could take 3 months, depending on the tool and the type of job you're doing. So pilot group was Black employees, and with the success we're seeing, we started partnering with universities to then expand this for a number of employees who would like to actually move even, let's say, move the yardstick even further and say, no, it's not just tools for me to basically become more efficient in my day-to-day job, but how can I actually now reimagine my skills into the future workplace where I may actually want to do something different? So we paired them up with universities, and a number of universities actually raised their hand to get them certification. And the certification is specifically as a future innovator, where it's not just AI. Not everything requires AI. It could just be robotic process automation. It could just be understanding what are the tools and how can I actually reimagine the processes that we have in the government. Last thing I would say is, and just coming again, government, largest employer, 5 generations working together. A lot of the processes in the government, many of you here are either working with the government or you receive services from the government. We are stuck in an era where the processes were built before the internet. So process updates, process modernization is where I would say AI is really going to be leading edge, cutting edge, if done with the employees who could actually be part of the change. And the very, very last thing is something I tell my team every day. AI is not going to take over people's jobs. People's jobs are going to change significantly over the next 5 years, that their skills and how they do their job may no longer be relevant. So it is almost like this dichotomy where how do you keep yourself relevant with what is required of your job?
Well, that was great. And just, I remember the typing pool. And the big boxes that came in and landed in the hallways and taking training on Word Perfect, I think, at the time, and PowerPoint and Excel and whatever. So you make a really good point, Vidya, about it's more than, AI is more than technology. And I was at MIT a couple weeks ago for a generative AI business strategy conference, and something they said was that 1x is the technology component of adoption, and 7 to 10x is the people side of adoption.
Okay. Like, did you want to add anything else for you? So we're going to move on to the third question, and it ties in nicely. How do we build skills and training systems that match our labor market, not Silicon Valley? Wendy, do you want to take that one?
Sure. So what I would say is before you can, I mean, one of the biggest problems we have in Canada is we train people for imaginary jobs, or we build bridging programs to nowhere. And I work at a post-secondary institution. We do lots of stuff that is not very effective. You know, it's not just the private colleges that have been predatory in developing programs. So I think we have to really think about training and education as a system. I am a big believer in liberal arts education. No one will ever convince me, even though I have a PhD in information systems and an MBA and all that stuff, no one will ever convince me that my undergraduate degree in history and English was not worth it. And I think that that's fundamentally what we have to think about is universities are all purpose-built to train people. You know, you have co-op programs, you have professional programs, but where the real opportunities are, in my view, are in the transitions. So I think having, you know, I was Vice President of Research and Innovation. I've tried to drive change within universities. Universities like to talk about innovation, but they really don't like to change too much. I think you don't try to make the English professors become AI professors and train people for AI jobs, because none of them have worked outside of universities. I think you let the education system do what the education system does best, which is creating critical skills, communication skills, blah, 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 blah. But you think about what the additional things are that graduates need in order to transition into the workplace. So I'm a big believer in some of the stuff that's being done with short, intensive boot camps, micro-credentials, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And you think about competency-based frameworks so you really understand what you're teaching. Because we know, for example, lots of university graduates can't pass the basic level of for literacy. You know, it's hilarious to me that we are holding international students to very high expectations in terms of their English skills, and often they outperform Canadian-born and educated graduates. So we have to think about pieces and how they fit together. And I do think that we can create graduates who can hold their own in Silicon Valley, but also can adapt to change. So I'm a big believer in ESDC, Skills for Success. I think it's a really solid foundation. I think everyone needs entrepreneurial skills. Like, entrepreneurial skills are not about training you to start your own business, although that may be an outcome. Entrepreneurial skills are about creating a growth mindset and learning how to see opportunities and navigate change. And those should be foundational. And I think we need to be very specific about what the skills are that are needed by employers. And the way you find that out is by talking to employers. So, you know, we have way too many programs that are being developed without any reference to what the real jobs are. So I think there's lots that can be done there. And I'm a big fan of the work integrated learning programs, like the student workplace placement programs. I think they're brilliant. I would refine them. You heard it here first. The AI Youth Corps. I think there are huge opportunities to take fresh grads, upskill them very quickly in those AI innovation skills, and send them out to SMEs to help with the transitions. Because a lot of SMEs, they'll buy the idea that there's an opportunity, but how they actually go through the conversion processes is beyond their capacity because they don't have people power. So you think about peer learning, reverse mentoring, and how we can both address youth unemployment and use talent to drive change, I think we could have a winning solution. And I really think that there are places for formal post-secondary degrees in English, history, philosophy, etc. But there are ways you can take grads from those programs and transition them into employment. And I say that as someone who invested a lot of money in a Master's of Fine Arts for my daughter, who is now one of the AI gurus at Boston Consulting Group. So the pathways are very different today than they were even 10 years ago.
I actually got chills when you mentioned fresh graduates and training them on AI. I think that's an awesome idea because that is a very real challenge for SMEs. So I also like your bridging programs to nowhere reference because I think what we're finding is that we have to be tailored and practical in our teaching and training related to AI. So we don't want to teach everybody everything. We want to teach them what they need to know. Anybody else want to add anything else?
I think the only thing I would add to that is I see this being continuous learning. Versus the saw that it's sort of like ongoing certifications. It's the muscle or the discipline to continue to take on the tools. I also was at MIT 2 years ago, and it was an amazing experience. And I also feel like it's stated already. Like it's just like every few months, re-immerse yourself in that. And that is what's building that kind of muscle. And then it also becomes a very real thing, like in terms of the purpose. That's how the stream was ever do. It just
Really piqued my interest there to jump in, Shannon, is specifically on how do we actually upskill? And you're thinking about SMEs here is, how can we actually leverage AI to have those, I would say, self-learning programs as well, self-learning courses, because that's something I'd like to have a few examples to provide when as the panel. Excellent. I love all of those ideas. I'm really looking forward to maybe seeing it move forward. Right. So we heard both of our first speakers talk about trust. So our next question's around how can we avoid the opaque box tools that weaken Canadian autonomy, accountability, and trust? And I'm going to ask Vidya to take that and maybe explain a little bit.
Absolutely. So when it comes to tools, of course, I have to say this, and I think Mark has laughed. I've worked with Mark for years in the past. Canada is one of the most innovative countries in the world. So like a mic drop moment, I have to say, is we have the maximum number of innovators or the population we have. Scaling up definitely becomes a challenge, not new news to any of you. So when we start looking at tools, most of the tools we work on, or actually we use, are not Canadian-made tools. That is starting to shift. We are getting there. We are really making real effort here in leveraging Canadian-made tools. And the big box is because we're using, I give this example quite often, even within Treasury Board or when I'm speaking within the government, say firewalls, in the tools we use, we don't even know where the data is saved. Most people don't. Most people don't even know what a cloud is. And they don't know who has access to their data, how they're using it. And those privacy statements in these big tools, I can tell you, I don't read it because I think it's 50 pages long, and then we just scroll and then do a check mark. So on one hand, it is number one, ensuring that we can have Canadian innovation for Canadians. Early days to really, I would say, speed up that engine. And I know that the two opening speakers today, they are at the helm of that. ISET is at the helm of that. I spent over a decade at ISET, so I have a lot of respect for Mark and his team to move this forward.
In parallel, the goal here is I'm going to speak about one tool that we are kind of like making more transparent, from opaque to transparent. Official languages. How can you have someone from the public service here without speaking about Canadian identity in 2 official languages? So I came to Canada with only 1 out of the 2, English. No, I'm fluent in the 2nd official language. But the reason I bring this up is the number of opaque tools the government of Canada has had on official languages. And not only do you pick tools, the cost. And now we have GC Translate. Open source tool. Because when Wendy was speaking about language, Wendy, that English degree, because large language models, people who actually come from the literature background, they are really going to be searching, and it's a very specific skill set. So GC Translate is homegrown, and I'm also accountable for official languages for the government, including servicing Canadians in both official languages. I didn't build the tool, but basically work very closely with my peer who built the tool, but the tool needs to learn scientific terms, needs to learn security terms. So here is an example of a transparent tool, to the point where recently I was meeting with the Ottawa police who have body cams that do simultaneous translation. And we're like, hey, we need to work with GC Translate. Do not use opaque tools that are, like, you don't know where your data is being stored or how that data is also going to be used. So I'm going to pause because I have a feeling Shannon and Wendy have some things to add.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to go a little bit of a different direction, though, is the use of the tools and the data in those tools. And it kind of comes back to something Wendy said in her opening, and Mark mentioned it as well, around human agency. And it's really the development of that skill for all of our teams, all of our SMEs, all of us, to understand when and how to rely on AI, when to challenge it, when to use our own judgment to override it. I think that's going to be one of the biggest pieces around using some of the tools. And as these tools get better, obviously we'll see less and less hallucinations, or we may see more creative and intense hallucinations, right? So it's really developing those skills as well.
Yeah, no, I think this is all critically important. The only thing that I would say, and this is based on my own efforts to transform we had, I don't know, maybe 60 full-time staff. We're kind of like a little unit within a big bureaucracy. And last July, I hired an AI consultant on a $24,000 contract to simply try to take my multiple spreadsheets and automatically produce the quarterly reports that my government funders want. Okay, 9 months ago, we finally got the security approval through the university to proceed with the contract last week for a $24,000 contract where the data were like lists of meetings and reports. And the reason that I raised this is, when we developed Ontario's digital technology strategy, Don Tapscott led that team, I think it was 94, 95. We talked about government as a model user, and we talked about procurement as a strategic tool. And what I would say now, especially in public sector organizations, that's healthcare as well. I was chair of the Women's College Hospital for a while. We have to figure out how to assess risk in a real way, to understand the no-go zones, to understand where the real risks are of using some of these tools, and to streamline processes where the risk is viewed to be not that significant, as opposed to applying, the same level of managing nuclear warheads, right, to automating a bunch of spreadsheets into a report. And we heard that at the last, one of the other Internet Society meetings, where providers of tools say that they go to organizations in Canada, and they'll say, who are your other clients? And it was Aaron who said this. And they'll say, well, we don't have any. And then they'll say, well, come back when you have some. And they go to the US and they say, who are your other clients? And she'll say, well, we don't have any. And they'll say, oh, that's great. We'll be your first. And so there is a real challenge in a lot of our processes. And I know that the federal government is working on procurement, but I work in an institution where the internal administrative processes are one of the biggest barriers to innovation and to adopting new tools.
Go with this one? Okay. All right. So thank you to all members of the panel for that very interesting exploration on trust and tools. And something else I just wanted to sort of tag on to something that Shannon had mentioned about knowing when to use it. Because just because you have AI doesn't mean you should use AI. And so understanding what does AI do best and what do humans do best is something that we need to, as an organization, as a society, grapple with, because it is a socioeconomic issue that we have to move forward with. So my final question for the panel is, what is one concrete idea to make AI work for access and inclusion, not just efficiency?
Haven't I talked enough? So what I would say is, and this is, again, I'm old, but Canada introduced a gender-based analysis in, I'm going to say 1995-ish, something, long time ago, right? And we've done some work trying to figure out, like, how do you update what's called GBA Plus. We worked with ISED on a model where you actually think about applying a gender lens, a race lens, a truth and reconciliation lens. You think about accessibility and so on as you're developing policies, programs, and implementing them. And I really believe that EDI strategy shouldn't be kind of a thing that bolts on over here, because then you can bolt it on or you can cut it off. But we need to mainstream those questions into everything we do. And that's why I keep saying, like, EDI is not wokeness. It's marketing 101. Canada has changed. And so we need to make sure that when we look around the table, we have people who represent Canada. When we think about tools, we recognize that there are Indigenous communities that don't have running water, and they certainly do not have high-speed internet. I see massive, massive opportunities with the new major projects, even with, and this is something some of you in the room probably have thought about, but a lot of people haven't. I think the NATO commitments to increase defense spending and the work around dual-purpose technologies could be the solution to much of what ails us. Because remember, people talked about Silicon Valley and they talked about, the Israeli entrepreneurship miracle. Both those things were driven by defense investments. And when you think about dual purpose technologies, not just being, guns and armored vehicles or something, but including modular housing, healthcare, transportation, internet access, internet tools, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those investments that are massive amounts of money, and way more money than the little pot that we have for AI transformation, massive investments. If we bring a gender, truth and reconciliation, equity lens to those investments, we think about community development as part of those investments, we could transform Canada very, very quickly with money that we're already going to be spending. So that would be my big idea for moving this forward.
Thanks, Wendy. I think as we start and we continue to develop either AI frameworks, both physical and autonomous, governance, the infrastructure, we really need to continue to focus on the things that make us immensely human. And, you can call them immensely human capabilities, enduring human capabilities, but divergent thinking and diverse perspectives is one of those. Curiosity is another one of those. Social and emotional intelligence. I was reading a paper last week that for people who don't feel that they're really that empathetic, they can start to use some of these tools to be more empathetic and to have more understanding, which I thought was interesting. But, building resilience, like things that only humans can do, I think is my one concrete example.
So I had not spoken to either one of them about this question. So I'm going to say, Wendy, I'm actually accountable for the EDI strategy for the government. I know you'd not know that. And Shannon, when you spoke about the human and the emotional aspect, so my idea is, so I'm just going to speak of the Canadian population. We, in comparison to other countries, the median age of our population is quite high. It's in the early 40s.
I balance the rest.
The last time I checked, it was 41 point something. Versus if you compare with India, it was 28. And this is a couple of years ago, so I haven't checked recently. And my big idea is that the entire Canadian workforce, because remember, we have people who are working in their 60s. So how do we ensure that all generations, not only the ones that are just graduating now or can just operate technology with so much ease? So I have more than 25 years of technology background. I can tell you, I'm struggling to keep up with the ones who are not coming from a tech background, but because it's the mindset. They were born in the internet age. My nephew he started using the iPad, I think, when he was like a year and a half old. So ageism is going to become, I think it's already there, but it's really going to become a big thing. And a big part of the Canadian population will not be able to contribute to the level they want to contribute. So how do we ensure that we are supporting through skills development, but also through opportunities, saying you can learn on the job? Because people come with a number of other skills. They may not have those AI ready skills or skills to use tools. How do we support them so that we are leveraging our population with large? Excellent comment about generations. And I'm just wondering if any of the panelists have any specific and practical ideas on how we might help people of different generations adopt AI. Does anybody want to pick that?
Well, I looked at Wendy's idea. Like, there's a matchmaking idea to be had here. And I don't know he could or would coordinate that among this incredible population of young adults that are struggling to find full-time or meaningful work with a demographic. And I don't want to say a whole demographic because my dad was a lawyer. He was also the first person I knew who owned a personal computer. So it just depends, I think, on inclination and affinity too. What you want to do, but I think there is an opportunity there.
I'll just share a short story about my mother. And she knows that, I've been into AI for 2-3 years. And she started out saying, I don't want to touch it. There's a lot of industries out there, construction, that are saying the same thing. And so I kept saying, okay, Mom, you have to get with the program. It's here, it's not going away. So she encountered an issue with her business with trying to do mass email. So now she uses AI. And so that spilled forward into
She was trying to create an email, and it was a difficult email. And so she reached out to me and said, Karen, can you AI this? And I said, sure. And I sent it back to her, I'm going to say 45 seconds later. And she said, so she's sorry. So I'm trying. Experiences are going to move the markers when they see what it can do. But thank you both, because you've inspired me to jump in over here. So we have the youth employment strategy. And a few jobs ago, one of the items that I was running was Job Bank. So a little while ago, when I was in front of the Deputy Minister of ESDC, because he remembered that I used to run Job Bank, I said, can we have expand Job Bank to ensure that our seniors have opportunities? Because, as I said, the way our lifespan is increasing, we may have a sixth gen, we may have people in their 70s who want to work. In fact, some of them already are. And we are really not maximizing the productivity of our country because they're actually feeling limited, because they bring skills that many others may not have. So I'm saying Job Bank, and with youth, hey, it would be I'm not saying senior employment strategy, but I'm saying maybe the they bring experiences, so the experienced employment strategy. It's so just throwing this out as an idea, but maybe I think did one of you want to jump in?
Well, I would say career transitions, hugely, hugely important. And Kathleen knows, as do some of my team, one of the things we're actually looking at is there are a lot of federal public servants who are losing their jobs right now. And we think there's a massive opportunity because so many people in the public sector spent their careers navigating uncertainty and adapting to change and nailing jello to walls. And often those skills are unappreciated. Like everyone assumes in the public sector, you can take someone from private sector, move them into public sector, and I've served on enough boards where we're always chasing the guys, mostly guys with money. And people, in my view, have always undervalued the skills that it takes to navigate in a public sector, highly unionized, highly uncertain, politicized, blah, 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 blah environment. So one of the things we're actually doing is looking at skills mapping. So when you've got all these federal public servants with what many people might think are a certain kind of skill, I would actually argue to some of the foundational skills you were talking about being required. They've got that up to here, but they may need new language. I can teach you everything I remember from my MBA in a couple of weeks. And I've done that. We've developed, rapid upskilling programs. You give people a few models, some language, et cetera, et cetera. I think there are massive opportunities to do bespoke upskilling, reskilling, and looking around again at employers, because we know municipal governments across the country have huge skill gaps. They can't attract and retain. Crown corporations and private sector organizations are having trouble because the entry-level jobs are going. The people my age are retiring. You can't replace me, with a 25-year-old and an AI agent, right? But you could take an experienced public sector worker who knows how to navigate, manage people, do this, do that, and in my view, upskill them to take on other jobs. So that's just a very concrete example, but that mid-career transitions, I think, are important. And the only other thing I'll say, which is a little tip in training older people in how to use AI or people who are resistant, is we spent a lot of time developing courses on prompt engineering, which I call the English major's revenge. Now you can actually ask generative AI tools what prompt you should use to get a particular outcome. That is so powerful. You still have to check, But those kinds of things can really, once someone sees, like your mom sees, oh, it can actually do this really quickly, maybe it's a next step and a next step. And I believe in incrementalism, and I think that's the secret weapon.
Excellent input from everyone. And I got the chills again, Vidya, when you mentioned the seniors program and opportunities for them. I might be a senior almost. One of the other, I guess, things to bring into this conversation is around not just mid-year, but end-of-year transitions in your career. And so at this conference that I was at recently, they talked about, and there were several different speakers that spoke to the same thing in different ways, but they were trying to get the point across that there are 3 stages. You learn and you earn, and the third one was you serve. And so they're trying to, I guess, instill in us that, we have a lot of lived experience and practical knowledge that we can bring forward to our younger generations. And so this concept of working and volunteering and helping our youth is something that I thought was worthy of mentioning. Franca, did you want to open it up for questions or from the floor, or are you... I didn't ask that earlier.